Hello and welcome to another video, and due to popular demand I'm doing a little mock-up walkthrough for my piece Pirate Waters today, because there are a few things that I've done here, and I actually wrote a lengthy article about what I did and what libraries I used, but there were questions in the Discord but also online about how I did certain things, and yeah, I thought I'd just show you a little bit more detail of what's going on with this track. So first of all, let me maybe just walk you through the general things here. So woodwinds are red, brass are yellow, percussion are blue, piano, harp are brownish, choir is purple, and then strings are green. So those are, I usually have my template in score sheet order. So this is also what's happening here. I also have one track that's called Noise Floor, which is just, yeah, what it says, a noise floor, because, let me just quickly play you, I'm not sure if you can hear anything. It's actually a recording of 433 by John Cage, so which is just a silent piece, but recorded in a stage. So I used that one to just not have too much of a clean sound when there are only few instruments playing. It's not a big issue in this particular piece, but I tend to do this nevertheless. It's a little bit, or it's quite noticeable before the beginning, which I like, because it's weird if you start a big orchestral piece out of complete silence. So I have this little fade in here before the actual piece starts. It's just very subtle, but it does help to make it a little bit more real. Yeah, this is one of the things that I do. Let's just maybe walk through the libraries that I used first, because there are quite a few used here. And also, let me just quickly walk you through which instruments is played by which libraries. So the first chairs of the woodwinds are all Cinematic Studio woodwinds. So first flute, piccolo, first oboe, first clarinet, bass clarinet, bassoon, and contrabassoon. And the second chairs are filled up with Berlin woodwinds. So you see I used the Berlin woodwind flute 2 here, the oboe 1, clarinet 1, and bassoon 2. The decision to use flute 2 here is purely based on personal preference. I just like the sound of that particular flute a little bit more than the first and third one. Yeah, so basically what I did here in Studio One is I used these the new sound variations function quite extensively, which helps me to reduce track count quite a bit. I used to have a lot more tracks, but due to this, the possibility to condense that all on one track with the sound variations, I reduced my track count quite a bit. I'm still a fan of having different articulations on different tracks, because it just gives you more flexibility. You can do different things easier. But with the size of a template like this, I would easily be running into several thousands of tracks, because I use quite a lot of different articulations and quite a lot of different instruments. So it's just not practical by any means. So yeah, this is more or less the decision why I went for one track for one instrument now, which is just way easier to handle and navigate. All right, so the next instruments here are, yeah, I have a horn ensemble, which is Junkie XL 4 horns, and the Berlin Brass 4 horns. The plus is for the stop, so this is from the expansion from Berlin Brass stop. There's also a stop single horn 1 and 2, because I used them on once. No, I think it's 2 spots. Yeah, it's this one here, which is this is currently just soloing the close mic, so it's not really useful, but let's maybe do it this. yeah, so there are a few stopped horn parts in here which are covered by those. Then I have as I said, the Junkie XL 4 horns. I like the sound of those a little bit more than the 6 horns, even though the ensemble here is 6 horns. But it sounds a little bit more symphonic, while the 6 horn sounds very trailerish already, which is not what I was going for here. I compensated the 5th and 6th horn by having the synchron horn and 1 and 2 playing with the ensemble. I used to do even six horns ensemble. I used to do them by having 6 individual horns layered on top of each other. I changed this strategy a little bit a while ago because particularly with horn ensembles, they always sound bigger than 6 layered solo horns. So this is why I, at least for unison lines like this one here, which is the first theme. This one I like the sound way better, or way more than having 6 solo horns. So as I said, I layered synchron horn 1 and 2 on those, which gives them a little bit more attack. The synchron horns alone would sound like this. Yeah, so you see there are also differ a little bit in the length of the notes, but that's not really a big issue with this much layering going on. Yeah, so speaking of the horns, synchron 1, I added the synchron brass a while ago, and I quite like them. So most of the, well, actually all of the first chairs are synchron, sometimes even the second chair. In this case, with the horns, is a little bit more tricky, so let me just quickly walk you through this. So first horn in the score sheet is synchron horn 1. Then I have the third horn, basically because I have most of the time quite a lot of the time, the configuration of the 6 horns is that 1 and 2 play one note, 3 and 4 play another note, 5 and 6 play another note. So a typical triad split out into 2 horns each. So this is why I decided to have the second synchron horn on the third horn, because that's a different note usually. And the second horn is covered by Junkie XL solo horn. The fourth horn is Berlin Brass horn 1. The fifth horn is Cinematic Studio Brass horn solo horn, which I used on the fifth horn because it has a little bit more dynamic range than the Berlin Brass horns. So in order to match them with the dynamic range of the first and the third, and also the Junkie XL horn, which has a lot of dynamic range, especially in the high register, I gave it to the Cinematic Studio Brass horn. And the fourth and the sixth horn, as you can see, are played by the first horn and the fourth horn of the Berlin Brass. It's a little bit complicated, but it makes sense like that because the Berlin Brass horns in this case are always just supporting, and I don't need to rely on them alone because they don't have the really high energy fortissimo, so this helps me to get a more even sound in the horn ensemble. Many people might ask why I'm using so many different libraries and whether this is an issue to just blend those sections, but I feel that this is always way more exaggerated, this problem, than it actually is, because let me just quickly play you these 6 horns on their own. So I don't feel like any of the horns falls out of the context somehow. It's not like it's sounding completely like in a different world, even though they do sound quite different. Here's the Cinematic Studio Brass horn, Junkie XL, Berlin Brass, And the synchrons sound way closer. So I gave them a little bit more reverb. It's actually quite interesting to see how much reverb they can handle. I mean, you hear this is a lot of reverb going on here. There's a lot of reverb tail. I still feel that it works really well. We'll talk about reverb later on in this walkthrough. So let's continue with the trumpets. Trumpets are synchron 1. The first trumpet is also trumpet 1. The second trumpet is trumpet 2. The third trumpet is Berlin Brass Trumpet 1, and the second trumpet is Berlin Brass Trumpet 3. I think I decided for trumpet 3 versus trumpet 2 because I think the marcados in the second trumpet of Berlin Brass are not the most pretty ones, and I needed to have them to match better with the rest, so I went for 3, which is also not the perfect trumpet because it again lacks a lot of the high dynamic range. Let me just quickly play you this theme here. This is one of the issues that I have with Berlin Brass, is also that between the articulations, the position of the instrument seems to be changing slightly, which is making things a little bit awkward. In the context of 4 trumpets, it's not a big issue, but if you expose them alone, it's becoming an issue. Let me just quickly show you this section on its own. Let's see it do this. In this case, actually, I went for 4 individual instruments versus, even though this is a unison line, versus a 4-instrument patch, because I feel that with trumpets it works better than with horns. Quite interesting how these 4 trumpets actually create this ensemble sound. This is just the first trumpet, the second added, third added, fourth added. So they do work quite well. Also in chordal configuration. Let's maybe just have a look at this part here, which is this this chordal thing here. Just quickly solo that. Yeah, so it does work. Again, 2 different libraries, but not a big issue. This is what the trumpets are doing. There's again a muted trumpet in here at the same spot that we had with the horns earlier, which is this one. Again, quite interesting how different this legato sounds compared to the marcato, even though it's the same mic configuration, but you feel that this feels like it's a way closer signal. And here it's becoming more ambient, which is really annoying. But again, in context of the rest, it's not really a big issue. And together with the horns, it sounds like this. Yeah, so not a big issue. But again, when you work on details, these things become annoying. All right, let's continue. Trombones. First trombone is again synchron. Second trombone is Junkie XL, solo trombone, and third trombone is the Berlin Brass Trombone 2, which I preferred, I think, again for the marcados over the first trumpet. Bass trombone is synchron. Again, mixing these libraries together, it's actually in this case 4 libraries, is not a big deal. I think the most problematic to match is actually the Junkie XL, because it's actually a different orientation in the room in Teldex than the Berlin brass, and sometimes I feel some of the instruments are not recorded at where they usually sit in an orchestral context. So you might have a horn on the right side. I'm not quite sure if that solo horn is on the right side or not, but I remember that sometimes I struggle with these things. Let's see if that is where this is coming from. Hard to hear in this case. Right, I feel it tends to be more rightish than on the left side. We could look even closer here. Oh, there's no stereo meter there, so but I feel it's kind of a mixed bag. It's not quite clear where it's coming from. If that was a solo line, I would probably figure out on the individual mic signals which one is not doing what it's supposed to do. But in this case, due to the ensemble work, it's not really a big issue. So the trombones. Again, the Junkie XL on the second trombone and Synchron on the bass trombone. It's again working quite well. The Synchron trombone sounds indeed quite differently than the Berlin brass trombones. Let me just quickly find a spot where this is noticeable. Yeah, so this is the beginning. Here this is the second trombone compared. So the Berlin brass are quite a bit more distant and quite a bit more indirect. So you can hear the different tones of the room here. But again, in context of the ensemble, it's not really a big deal. So it does blend quite well without making a lot of trouble because of the different rooms. Alright, so the tuba is a Junkie XL tuba. I tried out the Synchron tuba, but I went for the Junkie XL because it just has a little bit more balls to the sound, which is just a bit more suited for this kind of track. So yeah, this is the brass. Let's continue with the percussion that is going on here. Most of the percussion actually is Spitfire, per the SP that I have written here. There's just a few BP, which is Berlin percussion, and CS is Cineperk actually. It should be renamed differently. I just named this wrongly. Yeah, so the timpani, I like the Berlin percussion, which is just... Yeah, they actually come with left and right samples, so this is why you see these octave jumping or 2 octave jumping notes here, which is just left-right samples, which I just use. I have this beautiful shortcut on a Stream Deck where I can just select every second note, and then I can just offset these by 2 octaves, which is not a big deal. So this works really well. The Glockenspiel is obviously, as I mentioned, Spitfire. I like both versions of it. There is the hard sticks and the normal ones. You see my mic configuration is quite elaborate here. I'm trying always to push these percussions quite far into the back of the acoustic space, so they are not sitting in top of or on your nose. So they are giving us more of a spatial impression of actually being in the back of the orchestra. The reason why I use Spitfire percussion is I very often try out the other percussion libraries that I have, but I always end up with Spitfire percussion because for whatever reason, the Air Studio actually does sound really great with percussion, so I tend to use those. The vibraphone is also Spitfire. What's going on here? Sorry, here. Yeah, I think one issue that I had here, we'll come to that in a second, but I think one issue that we had was that I needed to quite heavily EQ the vibraphone. No, I actually didn't EQ it. I actually used Soothe here, which is a dynamic or a kind of an EQ that reacts dynamically on everything, which is great to just get rid of these piling up mid frequencies. Let's just hear. Yeah, it's quite a difference. So yeah, let's just continue where we left off. The next one is Spitfire xylophone, just actually for 3 notes. Sorry. Then tubular bells, again Spitfire. Then I use the Gran Casa from Berlin Percussion because that is the only Gran Casa sample that I feel has really this low end punch that I want and know from big orchestral Gran Casa. It actually moves quite a bit of air. It's quite a challenge to manage that one in the mix because obviously it tends to clip quite a bit because it's just so much energy that is being put into the mix, so you need to work a little bit around that. Snare is Spitfire. Again, quite an ambient. Where is it? It's. I think, let's see which one I used. Yeah, this one here. See, quite an ambient mix with most of the signal from the ambient mic. Then we have the Piatti, which is Berlin Percussion. I don't need to show everything. Cymbals is again, so this is suspended cymbal. This is Spitfire. Then Tam Tam is Berlin Percussion. Triangles, Berlin Percussion again. And then there is these ensemble metal hits from Cineperc. Sorry. Which is not quite realistic because there's quite a lot of percussion players already used in this whole piece, so it's relatively unrealistic that I can get more than one player, as per the ensemble that it says here, more than one player on these sounds if it was a real recording. But nevertheless, this is the best anvil kind of hit that I had, so I used it. Alright, so next harp is Berlin harps, which is great sounding. There's just no better harp than this one. It's actually quite a bit of noise build-up, as you can hear, especially in the glissandi. You see there's a lot of noise going on. But yeah, in context of this whole piece, it's not a big issue. The piano is Cinematic Studio Piano, which I like because it has the option to go for different microphones. The most other piano libraries that I have are these close mic'd in the lid pianos in the so they put basically the microphones in the lid on top of the strings, which gives a very direct and this typical piano sound. But for an orchestral context, I like more to have a more ambient sounding piano. So this is also why I chose quite a bit of, you see there's a bit of spot mic and a lot of room mic going on, which is the sound that I prefer for orchestral piano at least. I wouldn't do this if it was a solo piano, but in the context of the orchestra, it just sounds better like this. Then we have the Spitfire Celesta, which is again way better sounding than the Berlin Percussion Celesta. Actually quite loud, probably louder than it would be in reality, but sorry. Yeah, but it's works in this mix, and it's actually this passage here is quite not loud anyway. So yeah, I went for a bit overboard with the level of the Celesta. All right, so the choir is 4 instances, actually 5 instances of Metropolis R choir, Metropolis 1. The choir there, which is just actually basically split into female and male. So I used 3 instances of the females and 2 instances of the males. But they do sound great. They have this epic quality and still a great choir sound. Three. Edgy and epic as it needs to be for this track. All right, so we are at the strings, and even though the piece doesn't have any specific solo passages, I usually use solo strings to layer on top of the section strings because it always gives a little bit more detail, and just the fact that they are slightly different in the transitions makes it a little bit more real. Compared to just using ensemble patches. You see there's quite a bit of different libraries going on here. So let me just quickly walk you through what's going on. So let's just leave the solo strings for now and just go to the section strings here. So the first violins consists of Cinematic Studio strings, performance samples violin 1. So this is Vista and Conmoto. Berlin strings, violin 1, Hollywood strings, violin 1, Nashville scoring strings, the violins, Spitfire chamber strings, the violins, and Spitfire symphonic strings. There's quite a bit of layering going on, which I'll go into detail later on. With the other instruments, it's more or less the same thing, except for the fact that from the viola downwards, I also use the Berlin symphonic strings because the violins are horrible on the Berlin symphonic strings, but the violas, cellos, and basses, particularly the basses, they have this nice quality and the substance because they sampled this large ensemble, which really has these this very big fundamental quality. It's just this nice open sound, which I really like. I'll walk you through the layerings a little bit later on, but let's maybe just quickly have a look at the solo strings here, which is some solo strings from performance samples, which is, I think, how's it called, Violin of the Sea or something like that. There are 2 different versions of this. One is a slurred legato, one is a bow changed legato, and I used both here. Let's just quickly see where I used what. There's this one where I have the slur here. Yeah, so this is just this the middle part where I have this layout on top. Then we have I'm not sure if I actually used that. There it is. The bow change legato, which is in the middle part in the first part. It works just a little better than slurred legato because this needs to be a little bit more articulated. And then I just basically copy-paste the Cinematic Studio string ensembles to the solos, which just help to add a little bit more definition and detail to the ensemble sounds. I just usually try to be careful with runs because they don't sound great on the solos, so I usually mute them. And sometimes high register violins tend to become quite piercing when you layer them with the solo strings, but in this case I left them in. Yeah. So this is just to create a more dimensional string sound. Let me just quickly walk you a little bit through the layerings here. So basically, all the sections are led by Cinematic Studio Strings, which is my go-to library. There are a few things you can see here. I left out a few passages because I felt that there's this one issue with the Cinematic Studio Strings is when they go really high up, they start to become quite annoying. And so I muted them here. To be taken over by another library. Other than that, you see the sound variations that I use here are quite extensive. So a lot of different articulations going on. Again, there's a muted passage here. Then I use performance samples, Vista, and let me just quickly maybe show you this on its own, how it's sounding. Let's just find a representative passage. Let's maybe do this one here. Yeah, so this is how Cinematic Studio Strings sounds on its own. Then we have the performance samples Vista and Conmotor both in one patch here. I just called them Legato Bowed and Legato Slurred. So they are again doubling on the Cinematic Studio Strings. Again, the bow change here, and later on I used the slurred version, which is, let's take this one here. Yeah, this is actually the passage that I muted in the Cinematic Studio Strings. So here I brought them into the performance samples, Vista, basically. Then we have the Berlin strings, which I think I used for runs, and I think for a few high peaks in the melody. Let's see. Yeah. We'll talk about microphones in a bit, because I use different microphones here than the ones that are usually set as default. Or maybe let's just quickly do it in this case here. I use a lot of the AB microphone and just not so much of the tree, but this mic balance is actually not representative of how it actually is, so we'll get to this in a bit. Then we have, I need to walk back on my statement that I use it for runs, the Berlin strings. I don't in this case. Then we have the Hollywood strings, which I basically only use for runs, because even though they don't sound really that great, but they add this bit of variation, which is just helping to make this a little bit more believable. Yeah. Which is just enough to bring this across. Then we have the Nashville scoring strings, which I use almost exclusively, I think, just for the shorts. Yeah, it's just the shorts that are used here, because they add quite a bit of definition to to the Cinematic Studio strings. Let's just hear them on their own. You see, I use them quite low in the dynamic range. So as comparison, this is the Cinematic Studio strings on its own. Here there's a lot of body in the sound, but not these high frequency transient kind of things that help to make this a little bit more aggressive. So together they sound like this. It's just these small details that really help to get to the sound that I want. So then we have Spitfire chamber strings, which again I used for runs, because again the runs do sound quite good on this library. Also the small ensemble helps to really add definition to these runs. So if we just layer these two together, so Hollywood strings and Spitfire, it's actually quite a nice sound. I think the Cinematic Studio strings also do the runs. Oh, there's also Troll that I used from these Spitfire chamber strings. So those are basically just to layer runs. I think let's just have a look at if I did something else on the Spitfire chamber strings. No, it's actually just runs that they are playing. And then there is the Spitfire symphonic strings, which also use runs. Okay, I didn't remember that I used them for runs also, but I think I also used them for a few legato lines. Yeah, this one here. Let's see what that is. Yeah, I think on this mockup I tried out a few things, and I walked back on a few of the things, and some I left in. So this is why this is a little bit unorganized, more or less. But the runs actually on the Spitfire symphonic strings do sound quite well as well. It's just this layering that helps to really make these runs sound more believable. Let me just quickly try to find everybody who's doing a run. So this one should be it. Let's maybe go to this long run here. It's still not sounding like a real run, but definitely closer than any of the individual instruments on their own. All right, yeah, the same strategy happening in all the other instruments. Let's maybe just have a look at the Berlin symphonic strings viola that I use here, which I again use for runs. And what I usually do is if there's DVC in the strings, I tend to actually use different libraries for the higher and the lower voice, as I feel that this makes it a little bit more believable and sounds a little bit better. So yeah, performance samples, again, just legatos. Then the Berlin symphonic strings does runs and runs. It doesn't do much more. There's actually this lower tremolo here that it's doing, but apart from this, it's just more or less doing the runs. Then we have again the Nashville scoring strings for the spiccatos and the Spitfire chamber strings again for runs. I think on the lower strings, cello and basses, basically, obviously, you see that there's just the Berlin symphonic string used on the contrabasses, but also on the cello, I think they are having a way more prominent feature here. Yeah, you see I'm using the Berlin symphonic strings on the upper note of DVC, which is, I'm doing quite a bit of DVCing in cellos in general. Yeah, so there's a legato which I muted because it sounded better on Cinematic Studio strings. But you see most of the time the Berlin symphonic strings are playing. Here I switched around. It's a lower voice because I felt that Cinematic Studio strings and in connection with Performance Samples Vista just sounds a bit better. But here you see it's again the upper voice. So there's a bit of back and forth with these things. Let's see what the Spitfire symphonic strings do, if they do anything at all. Yeah, they are doubling on the higher legato lines. Also on the expressive legatos, I have the Spitfire symphonic strings. Let's see how they sound on their own. Let's just quickly find a spot here. Yeah, that's them. Yeah. Berlin symphonic strings on the lower strings, on the lower note, and then I guess performance samples and cinematic studio strings. Oh, actually, cinematic studio strings is not doing this higher line, which is also sometimes a decision that I make if I like the sound of a different section better. So this is the whole cello section. Yeah, so you see that this different layerings all work pretty well in spite of different libraries and different section sizes and different rooms. In the context of a big orchestral sound, they all do sound, well, they melt together way more easily than some people might make you think. All right, so this is the first part of the walkthrough. On the next part, I will walk you through the mixing, because there's quite a bit of things going on here. You see there's a lot of inserts, reverbs, and also a lot of mixing scenes that I didn't show you yet. We'll talk about this in the next section or in the next part. Until then, see you soon.